deep within the heart of an isolated wildlife sanctuary, where thick, unbroken forests stretched far beyond sight, the animals roamed freely. The air was thick with the scent of pine and moss, and the quiet only deepened as twilight crept across the land. There, nestled in a grove of towering oak trees, a solitary figure made her way through the underbrush. A wildlife researcher, Clara, had come to this remote sanctuary to study its ecosystems, an assignment that had intrigued her since the first moment she had heard of the place. But she had not been prepared for the world she had entered. Clara's boots crunched softly on the thick layer of fallen leaves as she walked, her breath visible in the crisp, cool air. She had been in the sanctuary for days now, observing the animals, tracking their movements, and recording her findings. But as dusk settled and the forest seemed to hold its breath, Clara felt something stirring in the air, a sensation that made her skin prickle, like the quiet before a storm. The wildlife she had been studying had grown unnaturally still. No rustling in the bushes, no calls from the birds, even the insects had fallen silent. The hairs on the back of Clara's neck stood on end. It was not fear that held her. Rather, it was an overwhelming sense of anticipation, as though something was watching, waiting. She paused for a moment, listening to the eerie stillness that surrounded her. Then, just as she was about to move forward, she heard it. A soft, rhythmic thumping from deeper within the forest. It was too steady to be the wind or the rustle of branches. The sound was deliberate, as if it were following a pattern. With caution, Clara crept forward, guided only by the dimming light and the thump, thump, thump of the unseen presence. The deeper she ventured into the forest, the more oppressive the silence became. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, just as Clara reached the edge of a small clearing, she saw it. A rabbit. Its fur was a soft, almost silvery gray, and it sat motionless, facing her with an unnatural intensity. Its eyes were dark, glimmering like pools of ink in the twilight. There was no trace of fear in its gaze, no sense of hesitation. It simply stared at Clara, unwavering. But it was not just any rabbit. Clara knew that much. There was something in the air, an unspoken promise that hung between them. She felt it, a quiet tug in her chest, an inexplicable connection. Her heart skipped a beat as she observed the rabbit's stillness. Something about it felt otherworldly, as though it was a guardian of the forest, holding a secret that Clara could not yet understand. As she took a step closer, the rabbit remained unmoving. Its dark eyes followed her every movement, and the thumping sound, once distant, grew louder, more insistent. Clara's pulse quickened, and the sense of unease tightened around her like a vice. She stepped cautiously into the clearing, her eyes never leaving the rabbit, and in that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The rabbit's body twitched ever so slightly, and with a sudden burst of motion it darted into the underbrush. Clara froze. Her instincts told her to follow, but something in the pit of her stomach warned against it. Instead, she hesitated for a moment, and then, as though obeying an unspoken command, she took a step forward. The forest around her seemed to shift, as if the trees themselves were alive, watching, listening. Clara followed the rabbit's trail, but the deeper she moved into the forest, the more unfamiliar the terrain became. The once familiar path grew tangled, the foliage dense and thick. The sounds of the forest had returned, but they were different. Suddenly, Clara's foot caught on a root, sending her tumbling forward. She landed hard on the forest floor, gasping for breath. Pain shot through her legs, but she forced herself to her feet, steadying herself with a hand on a nearby tree. She looked up and saw that she had stumbled into another clearing, a circular expanse, overgrown with thick ferns and wildflowers. At the center of the clearing stood a towering oak, its gnarled roots twisting above the ground, as if something had been buried beneath it long ago. And there, beneath the oak, was the rabbit. But it was not alone. The moment Clara's eyes locked onto the rabbit, the air around her seemed to shift. A shadow moved in the periphery of her vision, and she turned to see what it was. A figure, tall and cloaked in dark, tattered robes. The figure moved with an eerie fluidity, its face obscured by the folds of its hood. It stopped beside the rabbit, bending down to place a hand upon its head. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The rabbit had no fear of the figure. It merely sat, its gaze locked on Clara as though it knew she would come. The figure straightened, and for the first time Clara noticed that its eyes were glowing, an unnatural, unsettling light. Then, without a word, the figure raised a hand and the ground beneath the oak began to tremble. The roots of the tree shifted and parted, revealing a small, stone-like object buried deep within the earth. The figure bent down and, with a practiced motion, took hold of the object, lifting it carefully from the ground. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. There was something deeply ancient about the scene unfolding before her. The rabbit, the figure, the stone. It was as though the forest itself was alive with a forgotten history, one that Clara had unknowingly walked into. The figure held the stone aloft, its glow intensifying. The rabbit's eyes locked onto Clara's, and in that moment, Clara understood. The rabbit had led her here. The stone was not just an object, it was a key, and Clara, whether she was ready or not, had become a part of whatever ancient promise had been made long ago. As the figure began to speak without sound, Clara felt an overwhelming pull. The air thickened around her and a strange, dizzying sense of belonging washed over her. She was no longer an outsider, a mere observer. She had been chosen. In an instant, the clearing fell silent once more. The figure and the rabbit were gone, vanishing into the shadow of the trees, leaving Clara alone beneath the oak. The forest had returned to its quiet state, but Clara could no longer shake the feeling that the promise had been fulfilled. The rabbit had kept its word, and she, now a part of the ancient rhythm of the forest, would never be the same. Clara stood in the center of the clearing, heart pounding in her chest, her mind a whirl of confusion and wonder. The silence pressed against her ears like a physical weight, but it wasn't the stillness of nature she had grown accustomed to. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. The glow of the stone in the figure's hand still lingered in her vision, like an afterimage burned into her retinas. The rabbit's eyes, dark and full of secrets, flashed before her mind, the weight of its silent promise hanging over her like a shroud. Clara couldn't tear her gaze from the place where the figure had stood. Something ancient, something primordial, had been set into motion, and she had been swept up in its wake. Her legs trembled as she took a tentative step toward the oak. The air around her was heavy, thick with the scent of earth and something else, something she couldn't quite place. Her fingers brushed the surface of the gnarled roots, now still and quiet once again. She leaned down, her breath quick and shallow, her eyes searching the ground where the stone had once. There was nothing now, only the imprints of the roots, tangled and deep, and the faintest trace of something metallic on the dirt. Her hand hovered just above the soil, as if waiting for the ground to tell her what had happened. But it was silent. The sensation of being watched crept over her again, stronger than before, as if the forest itself was alive, aware of her presence. Clara felt the weight of her own breath, the slow rhythm of her heart, and the overwhelming sense of being an intruder in a world far older and deeper than she had ever imagined. She stumbled backward, pushing herself away from the tree. A pang of fear, sharp and sudden, shot through her chest. What had she walked into? What had she seen? And why had the rabbit chosen her? As she turned to leave the clearing, she heard it again, the thumping sound, distant at first, but growing louder with every passing second. It was the same rhythm, the same deliberate beat that had drawn her into the forest. This time, however, it wasn't just one. There were many. The thumping multiplied, spreading out in all directions, echoing through the forest, growing in intensity. Clara's pulse quickened. The path she had followed to reach the clearing was no longer clear. The familiar landmarks, the towering trees, the twisting roots, the underbrush, had all shifted, and the dense forest now seemed impossibly vast, its shadows deeper, its silence even more suffocating. She could no longer tell which direction she had come from, nor which way would lead her back to the safety of her camp. The thumping continued, relentless, rhythmic, and Clara could feel her breath quicken with the panic rising in her chest. It was no longer a distant sound, but something close, too close. She turned her head, her eyes darting between the trees, but all she saw were the dark silhouettes of branches and the faint ethereal light filtering through the canopy above. Then, through the trees, she saw movement. A shape, small, quick and silent, dashed across her line of sight. It was another rabbit. But this one was different. Its fur was darker, its eyes gleaming with the same unnatural intensity that had marked the first rabbit, and behind it, another and another. The rabbits came pouring from the forest, their movements fluid and swift as though they were part of the very air itself. Clara stood frozen, watching as they gathered around her, forming a loose circle, their eyes never leaving her. More and more emerged from the underbrush, their soft feet making no sound on the forest floor. The thumping intensified, and she realized it was coming from them. Their small, swift feet drumming against the earth in perfect unison. It wasn't just the rabbits that were coming. As Clara's eyes followed their movements, she began to see the shadows of other animals. Deer, foxes, and even a lone wolf, its fur silver in the dim light. They were emerging from the trees, their eyes reflecting the same strange glow, a soft, eerie luminescence. The animals, all of them, were gathering around her. The rhythm of their movements became faster, more urgent. Clara's breath quickened as she felt the weight of their presence pressing in on her, a silent command pulsing in the air. The forest, it seemed, was no longer silent. It was alive, resonating with the energy of its creatures, and Clara realized, with a sharp pang of fear, that she was at the center of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The rabbit, the one that had led her here, appeared once again from the crowd of animals. It hopped forward, its gaze locked with hers, its eyes unblinking. Clara felt something stir deep within her, a pull, a call to understand, to remember something buried in her soul. Her hand reached out instinctively, but as she did, the ground beneath her feet trembled once more. The trees groaned as the earth shifted, the shadows stretching long across the clearing. Clara gasped as the forest seemed to move with a life of its own. The animals, now silent and still, turned toward the oak tree, their gaze directed at the roots. The thumping, that rhythmic sound, was no longer coming from the animals. It was coming from the earth itself. With a sudden crack, the ground split open, revealing the stone that the figure had taken from beneath the oak. But it wasn't just any stone. It was now glowing, pulsing with an otherworldly light, and Clara felt a deep resonance within her, as though it was calling to her. The promise made by the rabbit, was no longer a whisper. It was a force, a presence, undeniable, and the animals remained still, watching, waiting. Clara's heart thudded in her chest, and as her gaze fell upon the glowing stone, she realized with a cold shiver of understanding that this moment, this ancient rhythm, was something she could never escape. She was part of it now. The promise had been kept, And the forest, the animals, the earth itself, it had chosen her. She could feel it in her bones. She was no longer an observer. She was a part of the cycle, bound to the ancient rhythm of the wild where the forest's secrets had waited for her all along. The rabbits, the wolves, the deer. They were not just creatures of the wild, they were its keepers, its protectors. And Clara was now one of them. Forever. The stone pulsed with an even stronger light, and Clara felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of energy coursing through her. It was as though the earth itself was drawing her in, connecting her to something vast and ancient. Her heart raced as she took a step closer to the stone, her body moving without thought, as if guided by a force beyond her control. The animals, still watching, seemed to wait for her next move, their eyes filled with a quiet expectation. Clara reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered just above the stone. The moment she made contact, a shock of energy shot through her, a wave of warmth and power that made her knees buckle. She fell to the ground, gasping for air, the world spinning around her. The light from the stone was blinding now, and she could feel it seeping into her skin, into her very soul, pulling her deeper into the forest's pulse. A strange sensation overtook her. Her senses sharpened, her mind cleared. She could hear the faint rustle of leaves, the subtle breathing of the animals around her, the distant call of a bird in the trees. The forest was no longer a place she merely observed. It was a living, breathing entity, and Clara had become a part of it. Her body trembled as the connection deepened, the weight of the forest's ancient promise settling over her like a cloak. It was a bond that transcended time, a covenant between the creatures of the earth and the humans who dared to enter their world. Clara had been chosen, not because of her curiosity or her desire to study, but because she had unknowingly walked into a sacred space. The rabbits, the wolves, the deer, all of them had gathered here, not by chance, but by necessity. They were part of the forest's cycle, its guardians, and now Clara was too. The promise she had made with the rabbit, that unspoken vow, had bound her to this place. She had been marked, her soul intertwined with the rhythm of the forest. She could feel it now, in every breath, in every beat of her heart. But with the promise came a responsibility, one Clara had not anticipated. The forest was not just a sanctuary of life, it was a place of balance. The animals were not mere creatures, they were the stewards of this ancient land, keeping it safe, keeping it whole. And now Clara was bound to them, her life entwined with the survival of this delicate equilibrium. She stumbled to her feet, her body still humming with the energy of the stone. Her mind raced, trying to grasp the enormity of what had just happened. But the truth was clear. There was no going back. She was no longer just a human observer of nature. She was part of it, a guardian. As she stood in the clearing, the forest began to shift again. The trees, the shadows, the very earth beneath her feet seemed to move with purpose. The animals, their eyes still fixed on her, began to disperse, their movements deliberate, each one heading off into the forest, their quiet thumping echoing through the air. Clara watched them go, her mind still reeling from the transformation. But she knew that she was no longer alone. The forest would always be with her, and she would always be with the forest. The rabbit, the one that had led her here, remained for a moment longer. It hopped forward, its eyes locked on hers, as if acknowledging her newfound place in this world. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the underbrush, its form swallowed by the shadows of the trees. Clara stood alone in the clearing now, but she felt anything but solitary. The forest was alive around her, its pulse resonating within her. She could hear the wind whispering through the leaves, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, the distant cry of an owl in the trees. The forest was full of life, and now she was a part of it. Its secrets, its rhythms, its mysteries were now hers to protect, to guard, to understand. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the darkness of the trees, and in the distance she saw the faintest glimmer of light. It was the glow of the stone, still pulsing faintly, calling her forward. The forest was guiding her, urging her to follow. With a deep breath, Clara began to walk again, her footsteps light but purposeful, as if the forest itself were guiding her path. She did not know where the journey would take her, nor what challenges lay ahead, but she knew one thing. She had become something more than she had ever been before. She had become part of the forest. And the promise she had made to the rabbit, to the creatures, to the land itself, was a promise that would never be broken.